The Culling Protocol. Chapter 1. The Red Notebook. The rain hammered against the windscreen of the unmarked Ford as it wound through the Scottish Highlands, each drop exploding like a small accusation against the glass. Arthur Blake pressed his forehead against the passenger window and watched the landscape blur into gray-green smears, trying to make sense of how his life had unraveled so completely in 72 hours. 3 days ago, he'd been filing insurance claims in a cramped London office, his biggest concern whether Mrs. Henderson's cat had really been struck by lightning or if she was attempting fraud again. The mundane rhythm of his existence, tea at 9, lunch at 12:30, home by 6 to his empty flat, had been disrupted by two men in unremarkable suits who'd appeared at his desk like bureaucratic angels of death. "Arthur Blake?" the taller one had asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes, but I'm rather busy with—" "You're coming with us." There had been no discussion, no explanation, no time to collect his coat or tell his supervisor where he was going. They'd simply escorted him from the building, with a kind of polite insistence that made resistance seem not just futile, but somehow improper. Even now Arthur couldn't quite understand why he'd followed them so willingly. Perhaps it was the way they'd moved, not threatening exactly, but with the casual certainty of men who had never been told no. The next 2 days had been a blur of forms, medical examinations and psychological evaluations conducted in rooms that seemed designed to make him forget they existed the moment he left them. Men in gray suits had asked him questions about his family, none, his attachments, minimal, his criminal record non-existent, and his willingness to serve his country apparently irrelevant. "You have a choice," the final interviewer had told him, a woman whose face Arthur could no longer quite recall. "Sign these papers and become useful, or we'll find evidence of tax evasion that will put you in prison for 7 years. The evidence won't be fabricated. We're very good at finding things that were always there, waiting to be discovered." Arthur had signed. What else could he do? "Stop fidgeting," said the driver, a thin man who'd introduced himself only as Control. His accent was impossibly neutral, scrubbed clean of any regional markers that might suggest he'd ever been young or had a mother or eaten Sunday dinner anywhere in particular. "You'll need steady hands for what's coming." Arthur's fingers found the envelope in his jacket pocket, the one containing his new identity papers. Arthur Blake, civilian, was being archived like a completed case file. In his place, Rook, Section 6 operative. The transformation felt as simple and violent as tearing a page from a book, leaving only the ragged edge to show something had once been there. "Section 6, Arthur said, testing the words. "What does that actually mean?" Control's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "It means you ask fewer questions and follow more orders. It means you've been selected for work that requires a particular kind of mind, one that can compartmentalize, that can function when certainty becomes a luxury you can't afford. And what if I'm not that kind of mind? Then you won't be coming back up." The car crested a hill, and Arthur saw it, a cluster of concrete buildings squatting like tumors on the moorland, surrounded by rusted chain link and warning signs that had faded to illegibility. The place looked abandoned in the way that suggested abandonment was itself a carefully maintained fiction. Nothing about the rusted fences or broken windows seemed accidental. It was theatrical decay, designed to discourage the curious. "Glencairn listening station," Control said, pulling through a gap in the fence that had been cut with surgical precision and then artfully made to look like decades of weather damage. "Decommissioned in 78, or so the records say. And the truth? The truth is that some facilities never get decommissioned, Mr. Blake. They just get buried deeper." They parked beside a maintenance shed that looked like it hadn't been maintained since the Wilson administration. Control killed the engine, and the silence that followed felt oppressive, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath. Arthur could smell something wrong on the wind, ozone and disinfectant and something organic underneath, like meat left too long in a warm room, or flowers that had begun to rot in their vase. Arthur opened his door and immediately regretted it. The smell was stronger outside, carried on air that felt too thick, too humid for the Scottish Highlands. It clung to his clothes and seemed to coat the inside of his mouth with an aftertaste that reminded him of the dentist's office, but wrong somehow, medical but corrupted. "Before we go down," Control said, reaching into the glove compartment with the careful movements of a man handling something that might bite, "you need to understand something. The previous operative, callsign Knight, went dark 6 days ago. His final transmission was—" He paused, choosing his words with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. "Unclear, but he left this." Control handed Arthur a red notebook, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. The leather, if it was leather, felt oddly warm, almost feverish, and Arthur noticed his fingers left brief impressions when he gripped it, as if the cover were made of something more pliable than it appeared. The binding was hand-stitched with thread that seemed to shift color in his peripheral vision. Black one moment, deep red the next. Read it, memorize it, follow it exactly. Control's voice carried a weight that made Arthur's stomach clench and his mouth go dry. Every agent who's entered that facility and followed the rules has completed their mission. Every agent who didn't. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Arthur could see the answer in Control's eyes, in the way they seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if he were already partially transparent. Arthur opened the notebook. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, but there were places where the pen had pressed so hard it nearly tore through the paper. Some words had been traced over multiple times, as if the writer had been trying to burn them into the page through sheer repetition. The ink was black, except for the additions. Those were in red, written in a different hand entirely, one that seemed less controlled, more urgent. Read before entry. Never speak your real name while inside. They know names. If the lights flicker more than twice, you are being watched. Stay still. You may see yourself in the hallway. Do not approach. That is not you. Between 2:000 and 4:000 a.m., the PA system may give false instructions. Ignore them. If you find a room labeled nursery, leave immediately and burn your clothes. You will be tempted to listen to Subject 12. Do not respond. Do not feel. If the notebook gains new rules, obey them, even if they contradict the old ones. If a man in a clean suit offers you a choice, always pick the option that costs you something. Below the 8th rule, in smaller text that seemed to have been added later, Arthur could make out additional notes. The mirrors lie after midnight. Trust your first instinct, never your second. If you hear singing, count your fingers. Arthur read the list 3 times, each reading making less sense than the last, while simultaneously making him more certain that he didn't want to understand what any of it meant. What kind of... Don't ask questions you don't want answered. Control cut him off, but not harshly. There was something almost fatherly in his tone, the way a parent might warn a child not to peek under the bed. The facility has been compromised for some time. The rules exist because previous operatives learned what happens when you break them. Some learned the hard way. And what happens to the ones who learned the hard way? Control was quiet for a long moment, staring at the concrete buildings as if they might provide an answer he was reluctant to give. We're not entirely sure. They stopped being the people who went in. Sometimes they stopped being people at all. Arthur felt something cold settle in his stomach. You're telling me this place is haunted? I'm telling you this place is worse than haunted. Ghosts are just echoes, Mr. Blake. What's down there is still very much alive. He handed Arthur a service pistol, the metal cold even through the leather holster. The weapon felt heavier than it should have, as if gravity worked differently on objects designed to end lives. Your objective is simple. Locate Subject 12. Determine if reintegration is possible. If not, he gestured to the pistol. Make it clean. Arthur stared at the weapon, trying to reconcile its weight with the impossibility of what he was being asked to do. In the insurance office, the most violent thing he'd encountered was a particularly aggressive paper cut and one memorable incident involving a stapler and a customer who'd been denied coverage for flood damage. I've never killed anyone. You have now, Control said, and there was something almost pitying in his voice, the way one might pity a butterfly for not knowing its wings would only last a season. The moment you signed those papers, the moment you put on that badge, you became someone who kills when ordered. The only question is whether you'll be good at it or whether it will destroy you in the process. They walked to what looked like a utility building, its walls stained with rust and something else that Arthur preferred not to identify. Control produced a key card from his jacket, not from a wallet or holder, but from a pocket that seemed to exist specifically for that card, as if his entire wardrobe had been designed around the necessity of carrying it. He swiped the card against what Arthur had taken for a patch of rust, but now revealed itself as a hidden reader. The door, which Arthur now realized was far thicker than it had appeared, more like a bank vault than a utility entrance, swung open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded disturbingly organic, like something massive exhaling. Beyond was an elevator shaft that descended into perfect blackness, the kind of darkness that seemed less like the absence of light and more like light's aggressive opposite. The elevator car itself was spotless, all polished steel and harsh fluorescent lighting that made Arthur's skin look sickly and unfamiliar. 7 days, Control said as they stepped inside, his finger hovering over a button marked simply B12. That's how long your authorization lasts. After that, the facility seals itself, and you become part of the containment protocol. Meaning? Meaning we fill the entire complex with concrete and pretend it never existed, with you in it. The elevator lurched downward with more force than seemed necessary, as if eager to deliver its cargo to whatever waited below. Arthur watched the floor indicators count down, B1, B2, B3. They kept going. B5, B6, B7. The numbers seemed to be moving faster now, or perhaps time was slowing down. B9, B10, B11. How deep does this go? Deep enough that screaming won't reach the surface, Control replied, but Arthur thought he detected something else in the man's voice, not just matter-of-fact cruelty, but genuine regret. Deep enough that some of the previous operatives are probably still screaming. They stopped at B12 with a jolt that made Arthur's knees buckle. The doors opened onto a corridor lined with institutional white tiles that had once been pristine but now bore stains that looked like abstract art rendered in bodily fluids. The fluorescent strips overhead hummed with barely contained electricity, some flickering in patterns that almost seemed deliberate, like a code Arthur wasn't equipped to decipher. The air tasted of copper and ozone, and underneath it all, that same organic smell Arthur had noticed outside, stronger now, almost sweet, like fruit on the verge of rot or flowers that had been beautiful once but were now becoming something else entirely. Each breath felt thick, substantial, as if the air itself had been contaminated with purpose. Control handed him a radio that looked like it had been salvaged from a museum of Cold War technology, all heavy black plastic and analog dials. Channel 3 for emergency extraction. But remember, if you call for help, you'd better have completed the mission. Section 6 doesn't extract failures, and if I complete the mission but can't make it back, then you'll have died serving your country. There are worse epitaphs. Arthur stepped into the corridor, his footsteps echoing in a way that suggested the space was larger than it appeared, or perhaps smaller, or perhaps space itself worked differently here. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the notebook in his pocket grew warm against his chest, a heat that felt almost alive, almost aware. One more thing, Control called as the elevator doors began to close with mechanical inevitability. Whatever you see down there, whatever you think you remember, whatever tries to convince you it's real or imaginary or something in between, trust the notebook. It's the only thing that's kept anyone alive this long. The doors sealed with a finality that made Arthur's ears pop and his chest tight. He was alone. The corridor stretched ahead of him, identical white tiles extending into a distance that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. There were doors along both walls, each marked with numbers that didn't follow any pattern Arthur could discern. 247, 003, 890, 1, 12A. Some of the doors had small windows, but the glass was either painted black or fogged with condensation that moved in patterns suggesting something was breathing on the other side. He pulled out the notebook and read Rule 1 again. Never speak your real name while inside. They know names. The writing seemed darker now, more definite, as if the ink had been refreshed during his brief time in the elevator. "Hello?" Arthur called softly, his voice echoing down the empty corridor in a way that made it sound like someone else was speaking. "My name is—" He stopped himself. The notebook had grown noticeably warmer, almost hot now, like a coal pressed against his chest. "My name is Rook," he said instead, and the warmth faded to something merely uncomfortable. From somewhere deep in the facility, a sound echoed back. Not quite an answer, not quite an echo. It sounded almost like laughter, but laughter filtered through water and played backward. Or perhaps it was crying that had been recorded and reversed until it became something else entirely. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls themselves, from the very air he was breathing. Arthur checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. In 2 hours and 13 minutes, he would need to ignore anything the PA system told him. He had no idea what the PA system might say, or why he shouldn't listen, or what would happen if he did. He only knew that Knight, whoever Knight had been, had followed these rules and still hadn't made it out. As he stood there, trying to decide which direction to go, Arthur noticed something that made his blood chill. The fluorescent light directly above him was flickering. Once, twice. He froze, remembering Rule 2. If the lights flicker more than twice, you are being watched. Stay still. The light flickered a third time. Arthur didn't move. He didn't breathe. He didn't even blink, though his eyes began to water from the strain. The corridor around him seemed to hold its breath as well, the humming of the other lights fading to a whisper. In the silence he could hear something else, a sound like footsteps, but not quite footsteps. More like something heavy being dragged across the floor, getting closer. The notebook against his chest had begun to vibrate. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the strange dragging sound faded, moving away down a corridor Arthur hadn't noticed before, one that definitely hadn't been there when he'd first looked. The light above him stopped flickering and settled into a steady, cold glow. Arthur, no, he reminded himself, Rook, began walking deeper into the facility, choosing the left corridor at random, the notebook warm against his heart like a second pulse. He tried not to think about how the fluorescent lights had started to flicker the moment he'd spoken his new name, or about the sound of dragging footsteps, or about the fact that he could swear he'd just seen a door marked nursery that hadn't been there seconds before. The hunt for Subject 12 had begun, and Arthur was beginning to understand that he might not be the hunter after all. To be continued,